to our speaker today. John Halaka is a professor of visual art at University of California, San Diego. He's a recent recipient of a Fulbright grant, which actually enabled and funded this project that he's presenting to you today. This project called Portraits of Denial and Desire. I want to remind you of the title of it. And also, he has a solo show currently running at the National Arab American Museum in Dearborn. And that show's running until the end of January. It's called Landscapes of Desire, yeah. And that show, from what I understand, is kind of related to the content of this show, so there's a continuity across his work. So he's really, you know, we have to be happy for his success, actually. And he's also going to be having a solo show here in March, and that'll be the third week of March sometime, so stay tuned for that. You'll get to see him again if you come then. We hope you do. And one last thing to say before I give him the floor is this project, which he's going to elaborate on, so I'm not going to summarize it for you, but one thing that I think is very unique about this project is that you know, he uses photography, drawings and video from raw material from oral histories gathered from Palestinian refugees in Lebanon. And that's really a wonderful thing to do. You know, oral history projects are wonderful ways to capture the stories that are not told, right? And so what he does is he takes that information, which is so interesting and vital, and he takes it to a next level through visual creative forms. So that's why it's really exciting to see what he's going to do, what he's going to talk about today. Thank you. Give him a warm applause.
Thank you, Samira, and thank you all very much for being here. Everybody hear me okay on this? Great. Would it be possible to get those lights off, please? Because then you'll see the screen better. I'll begin by thanking Samira, thanking Dagmar, thanking the Palestine Center and the Jerusalem Fund Gallery for inviting me to speak here. This is actually a wonderful thing to come back. I had a show here in, I think it was 2009, early 2009. It's really wonderful to come back and to be invited to have a show of new work in the spring. So this is sort of like a home for me, in a sense, my home in DC. I'm in San Diego, and I'm going to correct one little thing that Samira mentioned. I'm not at the University of California, San Diego. I'm at the University of San Diego. University of California is wonderful, big, remarkable public institution. The University of San Diego is a wonderful, small, private institution. Two different worlds, but two good worlds. So I want to talk a little bit about my project that I'm working on, and I'm gonna, to stay on track, occasionally read. I hope my voice doesn't put you to sleep, and if you do sleep, try not to snore too loud. So this project called Portraits of Desire and Denial is a multi-disciplinary and multi-phase project that I've been developing over the past 4 years. It's a project that I envision working on probably for another 7 to 10 years, or until I die, whichever comes first, like car warranties. My objectives with this project have been to record, to preserve, and to present the personal narratives and life-forming experiences of 3 generations of Palestinian men and women who experienced the agonies of exile and the horrors of occupation. Palestinian refugees have been and continue to be the forgotten survivors of the world. Their experiences in exile have been deliberately ignored, and their voices repeatedly silenced over the course of a forced and ongoing odyssey that began over 65 years ago. The majority of the refugees continue to exist unseen and unheard in the margins of marginalized communities. Preserving the stories of indigenous Palestinians puts a human face, a living name, and unique sets of experiences on this ongoing refugee crisis. It humanizes and personalizes the abstract notion of the displaced masses, making the experiences of the refugees infinitely more real, comprehensible, and unforgettable. It individualizes Palestinian narratives of displacement, survival, and resistance, making them unquestionably tangible and irrefutable. You'll very likely forget pretty much everything I tell you before you leave this room, but I doubt very much if you're going to forget these faces and a few of the stories, their stories that I'm going to share with you. For Palestinians living in exile, as well as those living under occupation, memory is the engine of our return. Memory allows us to envision and seek the denied security of our homeland. It enables us to creatively design the reconstruction of our shattered society. Memory inspires us to visually process, to reassemble, to visualize the processes to reassemble those tens of thousands of families that have been dismembered and globally scattered over 65 years of forced exile, of occupation, and of repression. My work on this project is a small contribution of the important task of preserving memories that have been deliberately denied and purposefully ignored. It's a very small effort to make the unseen seen and the unheard heard, so no one can ever say, "I didn't know." James Baldwin's statement listed above, when circumstances are made real by another's testimony, it becomes possible to envision change. He said this in an interview, I believe it was 1959, I can't remember the exact date. When circumstances are made real by another's testimony, it becomes possible to envision change. That quote has been sort of the driving principle in implementing this project. Preserving and presenting the testimony of the indigenous Palestinians are my contribution to envisioning and creating change, and an example of the art of survivance. It's my belief that art and literature are very powerful instruments of survivance. The Native American scholar Gerald Visnor coined the term survivance to describe the creative resilience of the indigenous people of the Americas against cultural and physical genocide. The term survivance is a combination of survival and resistance, and applies fully to the struggle of the Palestinians. Survivance is a concept that creatively employs memories, personal and communal stories, as well as tales of ancient customs and evolving traditions to convey a living culture that refuses to die. Survivance is the desire and will of a people that rejects being swept away by ongoing ethnic cleansing. Survivance is an active indigenous presence against political, physical, and psychological absence. Whether that absence is from the homeland, or an absence in the international discourse on human rights, or even an internal absence caused by the acceptance of defeat. Survivance highlights the process of active survival that is shaped by creative and moral resistance to oppression, resistance to institutional manipulations, to neglect, and to dehumanization. Survivance underlines the will of the individual and underscores the power of the collective. The former Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir, and there were many before her and after her, were fond of saying that the old will die and the young will forget. The art and literature of survivance are the antidotes to forgetting. They help to ensure that experiences are preserved and that current and future generations are well informed. It's a very powerful concept that Gerald Visnor creates, and he wrote a number of books about tales of survivance, about experiences of resistance by Native Americans, and this notion of very active survival, not passive, not just getting by, not the notion that we think of as sort of just existing until you fade away into nothingness. My work is informed by the careful study of history, and the history of Palestinian displacement has been at the core of my reflections on exile, resistance, and survival. There are people who try to claim that the conflict between Palestinians and Israelis is an ancient conflict, as well as a religious one. And there are many who have grown to believe what I think are essentially lies, as they've been repeated in Western media without much criticism for the past few decades. But the reality of the conflict is recent. It's completely modern, as entirely a product of colonialist desire to dominate the land of Palestine while ridding it of its indigenous people. Those desires continue to be facilitated by racist Western tendencies to overlook atrocities when they happen to non-whites. By preserving and presenting the narratives of indigenous Palestinian survivors, we refute the racist lies of the occupiers and shine a bright light of truth on the colonialist character of the theft, domination, and attempted destruction of Palestine. For the over 800,000 indigenous Palestinians who were expelled from their homes and homeland, their once ordinary domestic lives became little more than faded memories, while the lives of millions of their descendants who were born and continue to live in exile over the past 65 years are an ongoing nightmare of insecure existence. Since the Nakba, Palestinians living in exile are no longer seen as a people, but have been identified primarily as refugees. The ongoing occupation and destruction of Palestine that began in 1948 has created the largest and longest refugee crisis in modern history. And even with that horrendous distinction, even if we keep that very much in mind, I think it's absolutely critical to remember that the experiences of forced exile is not unique to Palestinians, but is part of a larger global discourse on forced displacement and genocide. As an activist artist, my visual reflections on the aesthetics of instability caused by the displacement, exile, and the terrors of genocide are not limited to the great catastrophe experienced by the Palestinians. My work is about human rights, the rights of all displaced and oppressed people. My focus on the ongoing displacement of Palestinians, their struggle for justice, and their return to their homeland that was stolen from them is part of a larger struggle for justice for all forcibly displaced refugees and all survivors of physical and cultural genocide. As an activist artist, I like to use the term the artist as public servant to describe my relationship to my work. My objective as an activist artist, as a creative public servant, is not to transform a community, but rather to be transformed by that community. The artist as public servant is one who extends himself or herself into the community with the intention of learning from it, being shaped by it, and serving that community with his or her artwork. I want the viewer of my work to become witness to the unseen and listener to the unheard from the communities that have really and truly transformed me. By working closely with Palestinian refugees and listening carefully to their stories, I've learned that all of the history books and all of the articles that have analyzed or continue to analyze the political histories of Palestinian displacement cannot in any way compare with the stories, the direct stories of men and women, of individuals, those living stones, those living narratives that are essentially history. It's the stories of individual refugees, stories that I gathered directly in the field in Palestine, as well as in the Palestinian refugee camps in Lebanon, other neighboring countries, that have reshaped my relationship to my work and have transformed me as an artist. As an extension of my research and the community-based art projects that I've implemented in Palestine, I began recording interviews with Palestinian refugees in around 2006. Sorry, I just came in from a red eye, so my brain is still foggy. 2006, and searched for and photographed their destroyed villages in different parts of Palestine. This was really kind of one of the most powerful things that I've ever experienced. Is I would interview individuals, get a sense of where their village was, and go in my little rental car and drive around and ask locals, where are the remains of this village? And stumble through thick fields of overgrown cactus and other stuff and find these ruins of places that have been destroyed and forgotten over the past 65 years. 531 Palestinian villages in town were ethnically cleansed and destroyed beginning in 1948, resulting in the displacement of somewhere between 800,000 and 1 million indigenous Palestinians. The numbers are disputed, but we know that a whole lot of people were kicked out. They were kicked out of their historical homeland And really it started between December 1947 and went on to about December 1948, the major part of the beginning, the first phase of the Nakba. About 85% of the indigenous population were forcibly kicked out of their land, the land that became Israel in May 1948. And the remaining 15%, the great majority of the remaining 15% became internally displaced refugees. So you have 3 generations. Now, the 3 generations later, the number of refugees in exile has swelled to well over 8 million individuals scattered quite literally in all parts of the world. So I'd like to share with you a few stories that I had the great privilege of recording. The first story that I'd like to share a small part of it with you, because it's a long story. You really can't share full stories of these individuals. Their lives are so complex, so loaded. The first story is the story of this gentleman, Hussein Lubani, who was born in the village of El Damoun in northern Palestine. He was born in 1939, and he was 9 years old when he and his family were displaced from their home and homeland, forcibly displaced by Zionist militia. Hussein Lubani's story raises a lot of very important questions, including the following. How does an indigenous person, and especially a child, process the complete and sudden loss of home and homeland? How does a person process the loss of everything that she or he knows and almost everyone that they know? How does a person process the dismemberment of family? Families literally being torn apart, the loss of their past, and the loss of all possibilities for a future. How does the indigenous person process the loss of identity? There are a lot of complicated questions that arise in Lubani's story, and I think it's important to raise those questions within our communities. How does that happen? How do people survive? How do they resist? How do they keep going 65 years later? I'm sure you a little bit. Let me give you a little bit of history. El Damoun was a village. Anybody here from El Damoun? There are a lot of people from El Damoun in the U.S., scattered all about. It's a village in 1948, it had 1,520 people living in it. And it's located in the Nakba district of Palestine. And all of its inhabitants were displaced. Not one of them remained by the military. And the village was completely wiped out very shortly after they left. And it was wiped out because they resisted. And Lubani will talk a little bit about that in the clip I'll show you. So after being displaced from their village, Hussein Lubani, a 9-year-old boy, and his family literally roamed in Palestine for almost 3 months, going from village to village to village and being repeatedly kicked out, repeatedly pushed away, repeatedly forced into the fields, until finally they were forced across the border, the northern border, into Lebanon. They eventually winded up making their way all the way north to Nahr al-Bared refugee camp, just north of Tripoli, where they faced cold, hunger, and hardship, but somehow creatively dealt with the catastrophic loss that was inflicted on this 9-year-old boy and his family and his country. So let me play for you a short clip.
خرجنا وصلنا على منطقة فوق سحماتة وفوق منطقة بسموها جسر حرفيش، جسر عالي لأنه في واد تحت نهر، جسر في من الناحية دي جندي من هاي الناحية جندي، جنود اثنين، في واحد معه مطرة اللي هي فيها مي، أي نعم، وعاء في مي وعاء خسره، فرحت له كانت معي ستة العاجزة عمية ماسكة من إيدها وطالعين إحنا في مسيرة العذاب وخارجين مع الناس اللي خارجين من فلسطين. فقلت له من فضلك اسقيني مية الله يخليك. قال لي روح من هون، روح على لبنان وخلي الحاج مين يسقيك مية. وضربني بقفا ايده تين على وجهي. مين اللي هب وحمش لي ودافع عني؟ الكلب. هجم عليه ومسكه من هون عضه وصار يشد فيه. اجر فيه من هناك مسك تك 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 وقتله للكلب. قتله وانا ابكي فوق منه للكلب ويطلع فيه الكلب ويعمل هيك. يعني منظر مش معقول لطفل بحب الكلب رفيقه، وكأنه الكلب عم يخاطبني بيقول لي يا حسين انا عضيته بدي انتقم إلك وانتقم لداعش. هذول هن والانجليز اعدائنا وما بيحبونا. اكثر شيء كمان عز علي اني انا كنت احب المدرسه كثير كثير كثير، كنت احب المدرسه كثيرا. فمن هيك امي عملت لي كيس للكتب، كيس تعمله هي صنعته وله علاقه من هنا ويجي هنا، حاطط فيه القران، حاطط فيه كتاب قراءه من تاليف المرحوم خليل السكاكيني، عندي كتاب في العلوم عامله سليم كتول، عامل ايه هالاشياء ودفاتر اليه. فكتير كتير بحبه. لما طلعنا من فلسطين ضل معي، نمنا طلعنا وصلنا عند سخنين. سخنين هيدي بلد سلمت، احنا ما سلمنا، من هيك بلدنا دمروها. سخنين بعد ما مثل ما هي، لانه رفعوا اعلام بيضاء ملاحف بسموها، وانا شفت الشوف عين هالشيء. نمنا بالليل قالوا لنا قوموا قوموا قوموا، اليهود اجوا بدهم يمسكوا الناس اللي هن قراهن قاتلت. قمت مع ابوي ركاد بركاد، قوموا قوموا، اترك حسين. نسيت شو؟ كيس الكتب معلق باللوزي، شجره لوز. يابا بدي اروح اجيب لا يابا بيجونا يلحقونا اليهود. طلعت بدون ما احمل كيس الكتب. اتاثر، قعدت على جمعتين وانا ابكي من هالمنظر هذا، كيف اللي بحبه ما ضل الي. كمان ب 28 او 29 اب تقريبا ظهرنا من سقطت بلدنا نهائيا. اجانا خبر انه اتركوا المنطقه هاي وروحوا لمحل ثاني. فاحنا وين نروح؟ الكبار هن اللي بيقرروا. طلعوا من وادي سلامي لحد كانت هناك زيتون واشجار لوز اي نعم ومشمش. ظهرنا واحنا ماشيين بالطريق على الشوك وحافيين وقش وصخر وحجار صخور وفيش طريق مستقيم. كنا نفوت نروح على طرقات غير مسلوكه فنمشي فيها هربا من انه اليهود او دوريه يسبقوا لنا. واحنا ماشيين شوب نار حمراء، اب اللهب. واذ الناس بيقولوا لنا يا ابو حسين يا ابو حسين لابوي. ابوي التفت نعم. قال له في جيراننا في فلسطين اللي هن بيت ابو نديم وبيت جميل جميل ابو حمدي، خاصه دول ابينا جميل ابو حمدي، وعنده 3 بنات من جيلي، نجمه وراقيه وفاتن او شيء هيك بتذكرهن ناسي. هذول كمان قبيل بيتنا بالضبط، وعند فلاحين وشي. دريوا ابصر من ينخبروا انه امي خلفت بنت سمتها سلمى. جايين هن وين كانوا ساكنين بالفتره هاي؟ كانوا ساكنين بشفا عمر. قلت لك شفا عمر قبل شويه انه خليط. دريوا اجى الزلمه ومرته وبناته الثلاثه ماشيين بعد فراق من 14 حزيران. التقينا وين 29 اب تموز يعني 2.5 شهر. وانا اول مره بنفارق رفقاتنا هيك، بنفارق بعضنا البعض كجيران، وانا هذول البنات بفارقهن. يا حرام هجموا علي، كيفك يا حسين كيفك يا حسين، وانا سلمت عليهن بالطريقه الفلاحيه، لا بوسناهن ولا سلمنا ونطلع هيك وسكتنا. شو بدنا نحكي؟ وما عارفين نفسر، ما لقينا تفسير للي شو عم يصير. انه اللي بيجمعنا الدمون وحارات الدمون وبيادر الدمون. طب وين انتوا رايحين؟ طب احنا بدنا نرجع عشفة عمر، انتوا لوين رايحين؟ ما اعرف شيء من شيء. جايبين هديه لامي سله بيض وسله تين، اعطونا اياهن، اعطونا من هون، سلمنا عليه من هون. اتباوس ابوي والزلمه جميل وامي وجارتها، ما ان التقينا حتى افترقنا. شيء انه التقينا وبدنا نحكي انتهى اللقاء رجعنا. هاي مأثرة فيي حتى اليوم، عمري 73 سنة حتى اللحظة بأذكرها بمرارة مش معقولة. ليه هيك؟ طب ليه احنا هيك؟ ليش احنا نقاصص القصاص اللي مش معقول؟ يروح بلدنا، يروح رفقات الدجاج والحمام والارانب، تروح رفيقتي تنقتل، يروح كيس كتبي اللي بحبه وما في شيء الا ما في شيء ضر، رفقاتي انا احرم منهن وانه كنا نلعب سوا. ليه هيك؟ هاي كبيره يعني شغله على قلب ولد صغير كارثة كارثة كبيرة كبيرة كبيرة، جريمة كبيرة كبيرة، وبدك الناس يقدروا هالشيء ويعرفوا ويقروا مشاعر الطفل على الشكل. عوقب بشيء ما بيستحقه، ما بيستاهله. كفينا نزول وصلنا على محل ولا بقول عم لافي وقف وصار يبكي. بسأل ليه يابا ليه عم لافي بيبكي؟ قال لي يابا هي هو حدود فلسطين، وهي هيك فلسطين وهي هيك لبنان. طلعت هيك الدنيا غروب تقريبا. ايه وبيبكي ولا شو بقول عم لافي؟ يا اخوانا يا حبايبنا، اللي بيحب يودع فلسطين وشوف اخر شوفه يطلع. نزلنا اول ضيعه بلبنان شفناها اللي هي مين؟ رميش بدنا نشرب. تركت 6 ساعة مع الناس ورحت اسال اسقونا يا عم اسقونا يا عم، ما فيش رميش في صار مثل بركه قريه، بركه ضحلي وحل صايري، لكن ريحته فطيسه، ريحته مش معقوله صني. اي نعم اسقونا. بتقول لي واحده منهن اشرب هاي المي قدامك. قلت لها هاي صنه وفيها بنص خنزير منفوخ وريحته ملي الدنيا ريحته. ما بدريش اسقونا. خلاص الاسباب انا عرفت، بس كبرت عرفت شو الاسباب. كفينا بطريقنا وين رحنا؟ داخل لبنان على بلد اسمها بنت جبيل زرتها هذيك المره السنه الماضيه كحكواتي. المهم رحنا وصلناها لغاب الشمس علينا هناك. انا وابوي الله يرحمه قال يا حسين انت شو بنسالنا ما جبنا شي بريق مي لامك واخواتك، اختك الصغيره هي الطفله مفحمه بجوز تموت. عملنا جوله وصلنا لمحل لقيت مره بعمري اسا لابسه اسود باسود وحاطه من شو اسمه عصبه هيك، وقاعده على البيت انت تفوت له في درجتين، درجه ثانيه مسكره نص الباب والظرف الثاني مفتوحه، قاعده على الظرف المفتوح هاي والباب وراها مفتوح. مساء الخير يا خالتي. قالت لي اهلا وسهلا. قلت لها عندكم مي تسقوني؟ انا وابوي. قالت لا ما في عندنا، منين المي؟ ايه ابوي بعيد عني شيء 6 7 امتار 8 امتار. قال لي يابا يا حسين زمطنا من اليهود، هيئتنا بدنا نموت هون بلبنان من قله المي لانه فيش مي. زمطنا من اليهود ما متناش، بدنا نموت هون بلبنان من قله المي. تعال يا حسين تعال. ولا المره بتقول يا صبي تعال هون. نعم اجيت عندها. قالت لي شو اسمك؟ قلت لها حسين. قالت يا شحاري وهذاك الرجال شو بكون له؟ قلت لها ابوي. شو اسمه؟ قلت لها علي. يا شحاري حسين وعلي ويموتوا مره ثانيه ومدين عطاش. باطل خليك. فاتت جوا جابت لنا بريق فخار ومليته ميه اشرب. انا شربت من طريقه مش معقول. ابوي شرب البقايا طلعنا شربنا 2. تفضل يا عم بارك الله. قال وقف. ايه طيب عبته من جديد. قال خذوه. قلت له ارجع لك. قالت لا خليه لكم. رحنا واحنا راجعين على الطريق ابوي بيقول لي شفت يا حسين لما عرفت اسمك حسين واسمي علي سأتنا. كيف لو تعرف هي انه اسم مرتي اسمه خديجه واسم اخوك الثاني محمد واختك الثالثه فاطمه كان شو عملت بحالها؟ كمان كلام وقتها ما فهمته، بس لما كبرت عرفت سر اللعبه من اساسها، وقديش احنا سخفاء، قديش احنا طائفيين، وقديش احنا ما بنحب بعض نتيجه التخلف والجهل.
Hussein Lubani is really, in my opinion, a national treasure. He's an amazing, wonderful storyteller. He's also the author, I believe, 17 books, focusing one book on his memoir. They're only in Arabic, so not a single word has been translated into English or any languages. He's written about Palestinian folk tales. He's written about a whole variety of stuff. And I had the amazing privilege of meeting him and spending over 2 sessions, about 5.5 hours recording. We spent a lot more time talking, but he was just so generous with his life. And we recorded in 5.5 hours, and we only got to about 1949. And there's a whole lot going on that we didn't get to talk about. He gave me some general stuff. But, you know, this is an example of how rich and complex these stories are. And how diverse they are. And of course not everybody is as eloquent and articulate and humorous as he is. he ties together all these histories. You know, he ends it with this sort of amazing experience that he didn't understand as a child, this sort of tension between Sunni and Shia Islam that has coming back to life, or has come back to life. This tension about sectarianism that has torn Lebanon apart over a brutal and nasty civil war. But he weaves it all together in this remarkably eloquent language. And what he does is that he shows how his culture was really kind of decimated, how it was sort of broken apart, how this beautiful, ancient, and tranquil culture that valued family more than anything else had the very concept of family taken away from it, had the very concept of history, of clan, of tradition stripped away from it. And that's a crime. That's genocide. That's a cultural genocide of a people that he speaks of very eloquently. The single most common experience that's shared by Palestinian refugees is the experience of loss. Sudden, total, and catastrophic loss. Whether rich or poor, Christians or Muslims, old or young, the great majority of Palestinian refugees suddenly lost everything and were driven off their land with little more than the clothes on their back. It's important to remind the world that this catastrophe was not caused by natural forces, but by the cruel hands of humans. It's also critical to remind the world that we have a moral obligation to act on our political responsibilities towards the Palestinians. Let me share with you a couple of short stories. And how much time do I have, just so I can I'll edit? We're good? All right. This gentleman here, his name is Abu Ghazi. His full name is Kraim Niaf Kanj. He was born in 1928 in northern Palestine as well, in a village called El Zib. And he lives in Nahr al-Barid refugee camp, just like Hussein Lubani. Hussein moved out of the camp because he managed to sort of become a teacher and educator, and he had enough resources to get out and help his family get out. Abu Ghazi, they stayed in the camp. And they left Palestine. He had one child, and they literally walked across the border with nothing, totally destitute, stripped of their ancestral land, farmers that couldn't farm anymore. And that's the story of Palestinians, and I'll talk more about that. The great majority were agricultural workers, people that worked ancestral lands for generations, and then they couldn't do anything. But Abu Ghazi and his family, just like the majority of other Palestinian families, they really valued education, and especially families in the camps. They valued education, and what they did is that they saved, and this is a very common story. They saved, they borrowed, they did everything possible to get enough money together to at least to send one child, and in this case there were 8 boys and 2 girls. Send one of them to a decent school. And a gentleman, one of the sons, a gentleman that I know, his name is Jamal. He was sort of the promising young, smart guy of the clan. So they saved, and they literally sent him to Iraq for high school with nothing but literally pennies in his pocket and a piece of paper with a phone number. And Jamal went to Iraq, and he was a young boy, went to high school in Iraq, did fairly well, and based on his smartness, his hard work, and his motivation to help the family that has helped him, he got a scholarship to a school in Texas. Then he became a civil engineer. And that's a very common story. You know, the rest of his family still lives in Nahr al-Barid camp, or at least what was Nahr al-Barid camp, because Abu Ghazi's story is very tragic on multiple levels, because not only did he lose his land in 1948 and get kicked out of his country, and lived through the Lebanese Civil War in the 70s and 80s. But he also lost it all again when the Lebanese army in 2007 bombed Nahr al-Barid camp to nothing. And it's a tragic and long story, and I'm not going to go into it, but what happened was that there was this bombing that lasted 33 days. The camp has over 30,000 people in it. Abu Ghazi and his wife lived kind of close to the center of the camp, what was the heart of the camp. That tent, remember I showed you that picture of a tent with the wind blowing, that single bell tent? That was the beginning of Nahr al-Barid camp in 1948. they stayed till almost the end, and then they had to leave, he and his wife. His son lived outside of the camp, what they called the new camp, and they went and stayed with him. And they came back after the bombing stopped to try to get stuff out of their house, but there was nothing. There was no way to identify even where the house was. And he told me that the only way they could generally identify the house was the leaning minaret of the mosque, which was bombed also. And he said, based on the minaret, they can say, oh, our house was in this general area. But it was nothing but piles and piles and mountains of concrete. The real tragedy of loss was that a week later, his wife, Ghazi, suffered a stroke and died a few days later. So this cycle of loss, this cycle of devastation, he worked 65 years to kind of build his family from nothing, now back to nothing. I want to tell you a couple of stories, and hopefully you'll find them intriguing and inspiring. I always felt very inspired speaking to these individuals. This is a story of a gentleman named Abu Rayak. Abu Rayak, his full name is Ibrahim Isa, and he was born in 1935 in Kufr Bir'im in the Galilee, in the northern Galilee, his village not too far from the Lebanese border. And my first film, I'm not a filmmaker, but I kind of figured out how to make some films, and my first film was about this gentleman. And he's a really interesting man. He was 13, I should correct you because he corrected me, 13 and a half when he was kicked out of his village. But he managed, after almost 2 years of wandering with his family, they managed to come back into Palestine and became what are known as Israeli Arabs. So he was part of the internally displaced refugees. And they managed to come back because they were Christians. And the Israelis wanted to sort of make sure that the world didn't take a bad look at him, so they allowed some of the Christian refugees, not all by any stretch, to return, but they rarely ever allowed the Muslim refugees to come back. And what happened is Abu Rayak, his village was, Kufr Bir'im, was declared a military zone, and they couldn't come back to it. But they allowed him to come back and to take over the homes of some of the people, the Muslim population from the village of Jish that were kicked out, about 18 kilometers away from Kufr Bir'im. So here he comes back, about 15 and a half years old with his family. They're given a home of another Palestinian family. And that's a really heavy thing to live with. The village of Jish was a divided village. It was half Muslim, half Christian, and the Israelis kicked out only the Muslims and left the Christians. And the reason for that is that it was the Muslims that owned the land. Christians didn't own land, they owned businesses. So the Israelis wanted the land, so they kicked out the Muslims, brought back Muslims from Kufr Bir'im and gave them the homes. And the village is very divided right now, Jish. Abu Rayak is part of that 15% of the population of internally displaced refugees. He was a farmer. He was going to be a farmer. His father, his grandfather, his great-grandfather, they had been living in the same stone building that he took me to, the ruins of it, rather, for over 700 years. And they cultivated that land. That's all they knew. The olive trees, the fields, the herbs, and the hills. And when that was taken from them, the only thing they could do was to become a cheap labor force. And quite literally, that 15%, the male population, built the state of Israel. They built the kibbutz, they built the moshavs, they built the towns, they built the synagogues, they built the factories, they built the community centers, they even built the nuclear plant. The Palestinians, as cheap labor, with no other options, have built the state that has occupied them. And that's a very strange irony to think about. And the saddest irony is that we're still building it. The wall that's being built, or just about finished, is being built by Palestinian labor, cheap Palestinian labor. There's a gentleman that I interviewed, Ibrahim Isa, from a village in northern Palestine, and he was also an internally displaced refugee. And he's told me at the end of the interview, he was very sick, and he literally, he was talking to me. I didn't know how sick he was, but he died just a few weeks after I interviewed him. But he told me in the end of the interview in this very hushed voice, he said, we were the masters of the land, than they came and made us their servants. And that line describes exactly what the story of the internally displaced refugees. Abu Rayak is an amazing character. Construction worker all his life, but he's also a poet, and a very eloquent poet. Part of this old tradition of spoken word poetry that exists in Lebanon, in northern Palestine, actually throughout Palestine, and he still practices it. So he writes, rarely actually writes, he recites poetry from memory, and he recites poetry to the trees and about the trees and the stones. And his tradition is often men, reciting poetry to each other about family, about culture, about land. But he's also an activist. He became an Israeli Arab, this really strange, nasty word that I think of. He's a Palestinian. Okay, we got 5 minutes, so I'm going to rush through. He became an Israeli Arab, and he could never go back to Kufr Birim. And actually, Kufr Birim was totally destroyed, bombed from the air, by the military a few days after the Israeli Supreme Court, 1952, said that the refugees could return. The military said, no, we're not going to let you return. They literally bombed it. Well, Abu Rayak and a few other men decided that we'll at least reclaim the cemetery. So they started to go and clean up the cemetery and began to rebuild it. And they got permission to actually rebuild. The military said, okay, we'll let you rebuild it. So over 40 years, he by hand rebuilt the cemetery, and he makes it a place where people from Kufr Birim, who are scattered all over the world, can go back and at least lay in their native soil. And one of the stories that he tells me is that the kibbutz nearby that has taken over all our land, that they send their cows to graze, and they deliberately send their cows to graze in the cemetery so they can trample the stones and poop all over the place. So Abu Rayak had built this chain link fence. Settlers don't like chain link fence restricting the access of their cows, so they always tear it down. But he tells me with this little smile, he said, every time they tear it down, I put it back up, but then I expand the cemetery by 2 yards. So I'm gradually reclaiming my land. So that's an example of survivance. There are a lot of tragedies in the history of Palestinian displacement, and one of the greatest tragedy was during the whole Lebanese civil war, which was a tragedy not just for the Palestinians, but for the Lebanese. But the massacre that happened in Sabra and Shatila in 1982 was really a horrendous act. And there are wonderful people here that know more about this massacre than I do, that have lived there, and I met them there. There was this amazingly horrible event, this brutal slaughter of civilians by Lebanese Phalange forces in the camp and in the surrounding neighborhood, in Shatila and the adjacent neighborhood of Sabra. The massacre lasted for 2.5 days. And we don't know the numbers, but somewhere between 1,800 and 4,000 women, children, and mostly elderly men were literally butchered with axes. And many were shot, women were raped and mutilated, and bodies cut up in pieces. And all of this happened with the direct oversight of the Israelis, who surrounded the camp and allowed the Phalange militia to come in and literally lit the place up with torches during the 2.5 days. But the horror of it too is not just this, that we are complicit, because a few weeks before that, Philip Habib, during the Reagan administration, had signed an agreement, this is when the Israelis invaded, that allowed the Israelis to dominate essentially Lebanon, or at least southern Lebanon, and for the Palestinian fighters to leave for Cyprus. So the camps were left unprotected, but the agreement guaranteed the protection of the camp, and that protection never existed. So there was this horrendous slaughter that occurred. A lot of people got killed, and a lot of people disappeared. I don't know if I have enough time to show you anymore, but let me talk a little bit about one woman who suffered a great loss during that period. She's actually not from Shatila, but from the neighboring or nearby camp, relatively nearby camp of Burj al-Barajni. But Burj al-Barajni had been almost destroyed, totally destroyed during that period, and they were sheltering in a literally broken down skeleton of a building near the Kuwaiti embassy, not far from Shatila. Let me tell you a little bit about this woman. Her name is Aziz. Aziz was born in 1930 in the village of Sheikh Dawood in Palestine, northern Palestine. And she had to flee the village under very heavy artillery fire in 1948. She was a young mother, 18 years old, less than 18 years old, and had 2 girls. And when the shelling began, she had one of the girls was recently born, about 3.5 weeks old, and the other one was just turned a year. When the shelling began, the family was out in the field, and she was the only person of her family left. So she put the 2 girls in a metal wash tub and literally ran out of the village barefooted with nothing but the house dress that she had on. One of the shrapnel from one of the bombs fell on the baby, on a 3.5-week-old baby, and burned her chest. And Aziz literally couldn't come back to the camp, was disconnected from her family, and wound up joining the masses of humanity that were making their way across the border into Lebanon. Her 2 daughters died on the journey, the youngest one from the burn, and the oldest one from drinking contaminated water, because they drank from whatever ponds or troughs of water they could find. So there's this 18-year-old mother, 2 dead daughters, and she's by herself for a year in southern Lebanon, over a year. Her husband went looking for her. Her husband winded up managing to stay in his homeland, but he left it deliberately, he left it willingly to go find his wife. And he had heard that she had been in a camp in Saida and went over there, and about a year later found her, and they eventually made their way into Burj al-Barajni camp. Do we have time for me to show you a 4-minute clip? Is that all right?
يعني هسه أنا طلعت من فلسطين لهون ماشية. إذا بقولوا لي بترجعي على فلسطين بقول لهم برجع ماشي. مثل ما طلعت وإجيت على لبنان ماشي برجع على فلسطين ماشي. بس أعرف مصير أولادي. بس يعرفوني مصير أولادي. أعرفن أحياء، أعرفن أموات، أعرفن بسجن. ما أعرف. أنا عايش بدويخة. قاعدين بهالبناية نحن جوا فاتوا علينا 2. شو دينكم انت؟ فلسطينية. كانوا عم باكلوا الساعة 8 الصبح اولادي، عم ياكلوا بتروقوا. انت شو جنسيتك؟ الله فلسطيني. قوم معنا، قوم معنا، قوم معنا. اولادي 4 ووكيل البناية وابنه وكيل البناية عمره 70 سنة وعامل عملية القلب وبراقي العملية بجيبته، وابنه عمره 16 سنة. وانا عمر ابني 13 سنة. وعمر أنا واحد من أولادي 22 سنة، وعمر واحد 25 سنة، وعمر واحد 30 سنة. طبوهن وأخذوهن وحطوهن بهالشاحنة، كانوا 3 شاحنات واقفين، حطوهن بهالشاحنة. قربت أنا عليهن، ابني أخذوه لابس بروتين مش لابس أواعي والبجامة، صباط مش لابس، ابني الكبير لابس حفايز النوبة. أخذوهن وحطوهن بهالشاحنة. حطيت قميص ابني على ايدي ورحت لنطيه، قام ابني وقاعد عامل هيك، سمع طقت اجري هيك، طلع هيك، قام طلع له واحد على الشاحنه، صار يضرب فيه، لبجه تمه هون، صار ينزل الدم من تمه، عمل هيك، عمل هيك، قام لبجه هون ببطنه، قام ابني عمل هيك، دبه من الشاحنه وصار يضربوا فيه، وانا كيف بدي أشوف هيك ابني عم ياكل قتل؟ كيف بدي أشوفه؟ مش أنا أولادي لحالهم. حطوهم بهالشاحنة وصاروا يروحوا هيك يجيبوا 4، يروحوا هيك يجيبوا 5، يروحوا هيك يجيبوا تلوا الشحنات 3 تلوهن مثل تقول واحد هيك واقفين حالهم من الساعة 8 الصبح للساعة 3:30 بعد الظهر، وهن بهالشمس بقاب، هالشمس حرقات حرق. وانا اركض هيك اشوف حدا يخلص لي 1 أو 2، اركض هيك ما لقيت حدا. وبعد ما صارت الساعة 3:30 خدوهن ونزلوا فيهن من عند سفارة الكويتية، توجهوا على المطار. كان في إسرائيلية، كان في من تعيين لحد، وكان في القوات اللبنانية. بس الشاحنة اللي ركبوا اولادي فيها عليها شعار الجيش. الشاحنة اللي ركبوا اولادي فيها
الجيش
اللبناني. ما عاد كيف راحوا فيهن، لمين عطوهن، وين حطوهن، ربك بيعرف. وبعدني من وقتها لحد إسا وأنا دايرة بالاعتصامات بالمظاهرات ما خليتش، يعني يمكن عملت أنا شوارع بجري وأنا دايرة أدور، وبعدني محلي ما استفدت أبدا أبدا. أنا بيجي علي عيد، أنا صار لي ولادي 29 سنة، 29 سنة كل سنة بيجي عيدين. أنا لا عيد أضحى ولا عيد فطر ولا عيد راس سنة ولا شيء بفوت علي. بطلع يوم العيد هذا إله قرابي بيروح يعيدوا، هذا إله واحد ميت بالمقبرة بيروح يزوره، هذا إله واحد بالسجن بيروح يزوره. أنا مين بدي أزور؟ أنا ما مين بدي أزور؟ شاكي أمري إلى الله، شاكي أمري إلى الله، شاكي أمري إلك يا حبيبي يا الله. شو بدي أعمل؟ الله يوفقك. وأنا بقول يا رب كل من عنده أسير، كل من عنده مفقود يتركوا لأهله، يتركوا. أنا بتمنى هيك قبل ما هن يجوا علي، أحسن ما أموت، يجوا علي قبل ما إني أموت، لحط 2 بحدي من هون ولحط 2 بحدي من هون، وأشم ريحتهن وأقعد معاهن جمعة طيبة وأموت. يا ربي ما أموت إلا أشوف أولادي إجوا وجاب. إن قعدت أصلي بلاقيهن قدامي، إن قعدت آكل بلاقيهن قدامي، ببطل الآكل. وشو بدي أعمل مني عارفة إني قادرة أنساهم، ما بقدر. والله جوزي مات، والله شاب بعده. قلت الموت حق، مات قبرناه، بعرف قبره. يعني إذا بدي أسقي كوباية من هالشكل بقول على الروح فلان، بس أنا مش قادرة أقول شيء عن أولادي، مش قادرة أولاد على الروح، هذا ما عاد بمسيره.
Aziz's experience is really, as tragic as it is, it's not unique. And that's one of the horrors of this experience. She lost her 4 of her 5 sons, rather, in one morning. She's taken from her arm. And she told me that she still sits by the window every night, listening to their footsteps, waiting for them to show up, waiting for them to knock on their door. 1982 was 31 years ago, and she's still there, and she's frail, and she just holds on because she thinks they'll return. And this tragedy of loss is amazing because she lost her 2 daughters in 1948. She got totally disconnected from her family, which she never saw again. Then her husband met her, they rebuilt the family, and then during the Civil War lost the 4 boys. In 1987, towards the last 3 years of the Civil War, what became known as the War of the Camps, her husband got killed by a shell that landed right in front of their house, and she literally saw his body dismembered. So this is repeated and tragic and complete and horrific loss. That's the story of the refugees. And there are many, many stories, but we don't have time, or should I go on? We don't have time.
I just want to know that word survivance. So is that a real word or a made-up word?
It's a made-up word that he made up.
Okay, and then you just continue to use that word. Okay,
Yeah.
okay,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. It's an interesting word. It's got a little bit of history because I've been researching its history. It's used in French, in the French language, but he kind of brought it in and kind of used that fused those 2 words together as an indicator of the struggle and the survival of the indigenous Americans.
Thank you so much for your talk. I think it is and thank you to the Palestinian Center for another wonderful event. Now, I think that your work is a very, very efficient indictment of the Zionist genocide in Palestine. And the fact that you show it to American audiences is extremely important because of the role of the U.S., who's the main complicit in this tragedy. Now, the oral history, in my opinion, and experience, is perhaps the most trustful source because nobody knows the reality as the victims of a catastrophe such as this one in Palestine and others. 2 days ago, I was in the Office of Latin American Affairs, WOLA, in Washington, listening to testimonies again of the victims about the displacement of the agricultural workers, of the peasants, of the black population, of the indigenous population in Colombia, to install an extreme version of capitalism. And the result is, since several years ago, 4 million internal displaced people in Colombia. Now, again, the main role is, the main exterior role is the United States government, in the case of Latin America also. My question is, are you considering, or have you already done this in other languages? I mean, the text or whatever you write, because it is important for this idea to reach the whole world, mainly the biggest languages with English, which is Spanish and then French, you know. And finally, my question is, in your research, how old, and I'm referring to the fallacious argument of an old struggle between Palestinians and Israelis, how old is the presence of the Palestinians in Palestine, which, according to the Zionists, up to the day before the creation of Israel was called Palestine? Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for your questions. So the first part, am I considering doing this in other languages? Yes, absolutely. I would love to do this in other languages. I mean, it's a desire. At this point, it's not a practical thing to do because I'm working on this project kind of alone with pretty much out-of-pocket expenses being paid. But I would love to be able to translate this into other language because this is a story that needs to be heard across the planet. And it's not unique to the Palestinians. So South Americans will identify very directly with what is going on. This colonial displacement, this genocide is very much a common story. So yes, I would love to do that. And I think down the road, I would love to do that. I mean, my plan for the project has 4 parts that I'm working on. The photographs, which I'm sharing with you, which I'll be showing here in March. There's a video archive that I'm working on where I'm editing these interviews, very lightly editing them, translating them, and putting them on this archive so that all the stories are available for scholars and students, anybody interested. There's a documentary film where I'm selecting 6 stories and weaving together kind of the story of Palestine from before 48 to the present through these 6 people. And then there are drawings that I'm doing, and that's what I'm working on. So right now, because the video and film part, I don't have the funding to hire editors. I'm working on the drawings and the photographs, which I can do by myself, and I'm doing the editing lightly. And I'm not a trained filmmaker, so everything is like very slow. But the translation, definitely down the road, definitely down the road. I mean, I'd like this to go, Spanish is a very important language. I want it to go in Spanish. I also want it to be translated in multiple languages. So the subtitling process takes me forever to do, but bring it into English, into Spanish, into Italian, as many, you know, and hopefully people will help. I want people, I mean, and I don't mean help, you know, but help like volunteers. I want people to say, okay, you know, I can give you 5-6 hours a week and I'll come and I'll try to translate little bits at a time, somebody who's fluent in Spanish. Because that notion of a community effort is very much what I work from. I've been shaped by this community, and I want this community to help shape our communities. So one at a time, volunteers is what I'm actually very interested in.
And the question about the age of the Palestinian
Oh.
presence in Palestine.
You know, that's one of those very tricky kind of thing, because yes, Palestine existed and the indigenous people go back, you know, 10,000 years, but a lot of historians, depending on their political affiliation, will say, no, they're all migrated from, you know, Saudi Arabia somewhere, and after Islam was spread or something like that. Essentially, you know, I'll answer it by saying this: the Zionists have this their favorite kind of advertisement for Palestine, for bringing Jews from Europe into Palestine, was that Palestine was a land without a people for a people without a land. Now, the land was not empty, and it was not fallow. It was very rich land that had people on it going back for millennia. You know, the Jews were kicked out in the first century in 70 AD by the Romans, but really, and that's a questionable thing because it was the Jews that were in Jerusalem that were mostly kicked out. The land was not emptied, right? So there were people there, Jews and non-Jews. Eventually they converted to Christianity, some converted to Islam. It's a very long and very complicated and very mixed, culturally mixed, genetically mixed society. It's really a multicultural society. And up until 1948, it was still a thriving multicultural society where Christians, Muslims, and Jews, where Europeans and Arabs coexisted with relative respect. There was dominance by the Ottoman, there was dominance by the British mandate, but people for the most part coexisted. And I think that we can return to that. I don't think that's a far-fetched thing. I think we can go back. I think Zionism is an infection. And it's an infection that either will kill the body or we will get rid of it. We will cure that infection. It definitely will change. It has changed Palestine. You know, I like to use the term that, you know, we can't unscramble that egg. We can't go back to the old Palestine. That's gone. But we can reshape a new society that is moral, that is multicultural, that is just, and that preserves and protects the rights of all individuals.
Thank you so much for this actually historical visual presentation that is so valuable. I mean, it was excellent, really. And I think you should also translate it to Hebrew for, you know, the facade that many Israelis are being, although the new generation, maybe they'll leave like the Afrikaners or stay as not Zionists. But I just wanted to ask you, Hussein, Abu Hussein's books, where can one get them?
Well, if you have access, if you know how to read Arabic, you can probably do a bit of a search online. There's I can't remember the name of the publishing house, but it's a Lebanese publishing house that has published all of his books. In the Arab, his name is Hussein Lubani, L-U-B-A-N-I. L-U-B-A-A-N-I. Hussein Lubani. And I came across his books in Arabic, which my Arabic is, you know, I can speak it, and I did all my interviews in Arabic. Reading Arabic is a struggle. There's an annual Arab book fair in Beirut, and the publishing house had all of his books there. And he's you know, well established, very highly respected. And he doesn't have email, which really bugs the crap out of me because, you know, we've gotten so reliant on saying, hi, how are you? So I haven't been in touch with him. Yeah. Sir, you had a question, sir. Please.
Historical point I
Please.
wanted to make earlier when you were talking about the original inhabitants of the territory. Well, I think the Bible confirms that the original inhabitants were Canaanites. And Canaan is referred to in the book of Genesis as the son of Sidon, one of the ancient Phoenician princes. And there's no question that the Canaanites existed long before
Very much so.
the Israelis. I mean,
Yes,
the
absolutely,
Jews arrived.
absolutely. Yeah, the land, you know, the land wasn't created when they were born, and it didn't stop existing when they got kicked out in 70 AD. It's a long narrative, and it's a complicated one. And I think I try to be very careful in not kind of answering in some simplistic or simple kind of little descriptions because it's too complicated for that. Please. So 3 questions, and I'll try to answer them all together if I can remember them. You'll have to refresh my memory. So I'll just flip images while you're doing that.
I think the idea of translating into Hebrew was a very good idea. Some of this is paid for by Fulbright, and so there's no reason why some of this cannot be shown in Israel, and probably could be. You asked yourself, I think you asked this in the beginning, is how can these people survive and endure? Have you been able to respond to that? How during Ramadan in the hot summer, when the sun is out for 12, 14 hours, it's over 100 degrees, and they fast, no water, in the middle of this horrendous camp, How do you understand that?
Yeah. I mean, it's, yeah. Let's take questions. I'll try to answer them all at once. So anybody else have other questions you'd like to raise or comments? Feel free to. Okay. Yeah, I mean, the Arabic word sabr, patience, is at the very core of the culture. Patience, we wait. And the national symbol for Palestine is the sabr, which is also the word used to describe cactus, which is a very patient, tolerant plant that can outweigh all sort of droughts and even be cut up and displaced and dismembered, and anywhere you put it will come back to life. So it's a culture that at its very core is a survivalist culture. How do they do it? I'm amazed. I don't have an answer. I'm flabbergasted. When I sit with Aziz, and she tells me of waiting 30 years, 29 years when I met her, sitting by the window every night, listening. How do you do that? I mean, of course, part of you wants to say, come on, lady, 29 years, they're not coming back. And then you slap myself in the head, say, no. This is what she's living for. So part of the narrative of resistance is surviving tremendous assaults on you and literally kind of just waiting them out. But there's also an aspect of kind of a delusional aspect in there. It's like you keep waiting and maybe something else doesn't happen. So it's balancing that notion of waiting, of patience, of surviving, but also figuring out a creative way to resist. And I think some Palestinians have managed to do that very effectively. Others have not. Others have sort of gone into the old method of just the only resistance is the weapon, the gun, which has, in my opinion, brought us nothing but misery and destruction. Right? So we have to be more creative in how we confront this enemy. An enemy that's not going to go away. A lot of people live on wishful thinking. Yeah, you can have wishful thinking, but it ain't going to happen by itself, So it's a complicated thing. But yeah, survival is at the very core of the culture, and patience.
Thank you, John.
My pleasure. Thank you very much for your thoughtfulness. Thank you all very much. I'll just show you images here. All right, feel free to ask any questions that you want. And actually, Oscar, in response to your question, this is only the third time I've given similar presentations. So we're just beginning the process. So hopefully we'll get it going elsewhere. Thank you guys for coming out. Feel free to ask questions informally, whatever.